So I joined the Film and Television Archive a little over a year ago, but that 1 year really represents over 200 years of experience amongst the amazing staff that I work with. It is humbling to be surrounded by so much experience and excellence. And one of the things I've admired of the team when joining UCLA was a deep commitment to collaboration. It is something I've sought more of in our screenings, our preservation work and projects. And tonight, I'm proud to say we have an amazing set of partners. So I want to acknowledge all of them here tonight. Presenting this evening with us are Outfest, the Bruin Film Society, and UCLA Library Special Collections. I want to also thank our special community partners, the UCLA LGBT Campus Resource Center, UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, UCLA Department of Sociology, UCLA Transgender UCLA Pride, the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law, UCLA Center for the Study of Women, and our media partner, Outright News Magazine, and you can grab one of those on your way out tonight as well. Big round of applause for all our partners, please. When the Film and Television Archive joined the UCLA Library just in October 2019, we became more closely aligned with the UCLA Library's world-class archival and research collections. UCLA Library Special Collections is where some of the papers of Harold Garfinkel are accessible. Questions around Garfinkel's research and archives are central to this film, and you'll see it tonight. So tonight, as partners on tonight's event and tomorrow's conversation, which I'll share more about later, we're joined by my colleague in Library Special Collections to talk about the great work that they do. Jet Jacobs is the head of Public Services, Outreach, and Community Engagement for UCLA Library Special Collections. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hello. So library is let's start that again. My first public speaking event in like 3 years. Library Special Collections at UCLA stewards and makes available the distinctive materials that facilitate original research and critical inquiry. We do this by encouraging their use in our publicly available reading room within the Charles E. Young Research Library, as well as collaborating with undergraduate and graduate courses to embed exploration and primary source literacy into curriculum across disciplines. We do this with the knowledge that many past collections and descriptive practices have historically privileged and upheld existing power structures, often to the detriment of numerous individuals and communities. Though we do not hold the specific materials that were consulted for this film, we do hold selected papers from Garfinkel and other researchers that were involved in UCLA's gender clinic. And these collections do reflect the motives and the biases of those individuals. The promise of original research using primary resources is at its best an opportunity to interrogate and question and potentially disrupt these biases. And in doing so, uncover the voices of the the voices and the experiences that have been neglected, excluded, and often outright suppressed from written history. It's also an opportunity to discuss the ethical and privacy-related concerns surrounding past research, as well as those current approaches to analyze these materials and the stories that they contain through a modern lens. If you'd like to be part of this conversation, which I really hope you would like to be, I invite you to join us for a discussion with director, writer, and producer Chase Joynt, along with Kristen Schilt and Vanessa Worry at the Charles E. Young Research Library tomorrow evening. So the speakers will be leading a dialogue on transgender, two-spirit, gender-expansive, and intersex representation, the history of TGI-related research at UCLA, and current organizing efforts for ethical, informed, community-driven, and justice-centered research around TGI people. Light refreshments will be served at 6 p.m., and the discussion will begin at 7, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Did you dye your hair for the screening so that you can match everything here? It's really good. Thank you so much, Jet, for joining us. And now a little bit of why we're here today. So when I saw Framing Agnes online at Sundance this year, I knew quickly that the film needed to come to UCLA, and you'll see why. Actually, one of our programmers, KJ Ralph Miller, and I was telling somebody, I was actually emailing her saying, you have to watch the film while I was watching it. So really excited to bring it here. Rooted deep in painful and unethical histories that took place on campus, Framing Agnes gives space for the questions and provocations that make archival work and creative work so interesting and crucial. I was drawn to the way that this hybrid film brought to life the complexities of identity and ethical issues in archive and research that are still, unfortunately, relevant today. There are layers of questions and ideas posed by the film, so sharp in its inquiries and brilliant in crafting multiple views through documentary and narrative storytelling. I look forward to peeling this apart more in the conversation with you all after the screening. Despite the complicated histories revealed in the film, I can say that UCLA is proud to be ranked nationally as a top LGBTQ and trans-friendly campus now. One of the ways our campus is continuing to improve experiences of transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender non-conforming community members is the appointment of a new implementation committee. The UCLA Gender Recognition Implementation Committee's charge is to ensure our campus updates our policies, data systems, facilities, and practices to better support community members of all genders. The UCLA LGBTQ Campus Resource Center, one of our partners for this program, is also a strong leader and resource for the advocacy and inclusion of trans and non-binary Bruins. You can learn more about our campus's efforts at lgbtq.ucla.edu. We are joined tonight with some fantastic guests for the film. Unfortunately, however, Jules Gill-Peterson has laryngitis and is unable to join us. She's very sad that she couldn't be here and sends her regards. But you'll hear her fantastic perspectives and voice in the film. Framing Agnes is a remarkable breathing document, one that interacts with audiences and archives in ways that I hope will make for an interesting conversation. Following the screening, we're thrilled that participants Zackary Drucker and Kristen Schilt and director, writer, and producer Chase Joynt will join us in a Q&A session. But before we begin, and before the film starts very shortly, please join me in welcoming Chase to the stage to share some remarks about the film.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. Thanks, May and KJ and Jet. Our whole team was standing in the lobby while the queue was extending outside, speaking at length about how queer it looked and how happy we were. No offense to the non-queer looking people in the room. We are so thrilled to be here. Our team is stacked with Bruins. As I was sitting listening to the remarks, I was thinking about how many different versions of things I came out as on campus over the many years, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to continue these conversations in this specific space. My collaborator and dear friend Kristen Schilt, the sociological research anchor of our project, was in the lobby and looked at me and said, "The ethnomethodologists are here." And I was like, never have the ethnomethodologists heard this in a theater before, breaking some boundaries. But in all seriousness, it's a fiction and a misnomer to summarize this project as a solo authored or directed pursuit. It is a deeply and enduringly collaborative project, and I'm joined here in the house by some of the key project collaborators, Brooke Siebold, editor and co-producer. Stand up, Brooke, if you can. Becky Gebhardt, fellow Bruin composer. Kristen Schilt, sociologist, research anchor. Zackary Drucker, star and participant. Samantha Curley, producer extraordinaire. We have Lex taking pictures. We have Miles, our impact producer in the house, I believe, and perhaps others who have arrived who I don't have on my radar and I'm going to have to make up for as soon as the screening is over. Thanks for being here. We'll see you on the other side.
Zackary Drucker, independent artist, filmmaker, and cultural producer. Chase Joynt, director, writer, producer. Kristen Schilt, associate professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. That was my introduction for you all. Sorry.
Thanks.
So efficient.
Thank you so much for joining us and like for this tremendous project. It's been years in the making, and so kind of the first question, kind of an obvious one, but one that I think the audience would love to hear about, is kind of how this project came to being and how you all, the three of you, part of also the short and obviously now the feature, like how did this all come about? So I'd love to hear that.
Oh, we're going to go way back. We're starting with you.
So Chase and I, we always like to say, since we're at UCLA, we met in the first class I ever TA'd as a graduate student. Chase was an undergrad in that class, and we've been BFFs ever since.
But if we wanted to further disclose, we would say that we were the two very obviously queer-looking people in a room full of seemingly not queer-looking people. It's like I set it up at the beginning. Here we are, delivering. And we recognized each other across the room and thought, like, perhaps we should know each other as a way to navigate this place.
Yeah, but about this project, it started in 2013. We received a Mellon Fellowship at the University of Chicago, that this very rare fellowship from the Gray Center that supported an artist to come work for a year in collaboration with an academic. And so Chase came and worked with me, and the only requirement was that you had to teach a class together. And we taught a class. One of our students is here today. Shout out to you, Ellen. From that, we started working on, we were looking at the question of how do you tell a story through documentary film and also through social science research, and what does it mean to talk about the truth? And through that, we started looking at the Agnes case, which to me as a sociologist is an example of this, because it's been written about probably 50 times in different readings of this case, and so in academic writing and in blogs. And so we were interested in how the story had kind of changed over time, and then we decided to try to do some archival research.
And then after we found the case files, it was striking to notice the relationship between the questions that researchers were asking trans people and the questions that were being asked on talk show stages writ large. And so we thought, what happens if we pay close attention to those questions, and what if we start collapsing these contexts and thinking about more creative ways to engage the material? And so we made some calls to some of our favorite people to ask them to walk toward a project in formation, and we made a short version of the film that premiered in 2019 and really started developing the feature with a little bit more time and a little bit more money and an extraordinary team of collaborators with whom it would not have been possible.
That's so great. And Zackary, can you share how you became part of the project as well?
I just would love to express gratitude for all of you being here and for this convening. And it was such a disappointment not to get to go to Sundance IRL and to see it and just being in this theater in particular on this particular night with these particular people. It's a gift. I love this theater. I feel like we are surrounded by the spirits of our ancestors, by potentially our descendants, by legendary queens like Billie Wilder, and the many, and brilliant, and the many queens that have graced this stage. I think of my aunt Holly Woodlawn and Flawless Sabrina. I think of the recently deceased woman who was wearing this blazer, and wish I got from an estate sale. I'm also in gratitude for...
We're going far back into how you were involved. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Being able to drive a 1950s Thunderbird all the way to Santa Monica and back. But the point I wanted to make is that we're in a room full of people, and we bring so much of ourselves to our understanding of these ephemeral spirits that we have lost. I wonder, did Agnes know that she was Agnes? Did she know how infamous her position in this history would be? I think about all of the legends whose names we know, and the ones whose names we don't know. All of these subjects, we don't know their names, but by speaking their words, we are resurrecting them and embodying them in a corporeal way. It's such an incredible, I think, exorcising of lost histories, and it's such an incredible confluence of, I think, pedagogical approaches to understanding history and art and inhabiting, spirits.
One of the things that I was really moved by was something that Jules mentioned that her professor had sort of talked to her about was our job is not to act as if we know about people something that they don't know about themselves, right? And as an archivist, and obviously an archivist of moving images, but I think a lot about sort of the creative role, the significance of what somebody like you and this collaborative team that you've put together really are trying to do, which is in some way channel and embody something about representation, but leaving without feeling like I know these people fully, right? And that's like the tension that you have in this film that's so interesting to me. I would love if you could talk a little bit about some of that in terms of how you've all kind of engaged in that, because you flow between these like in and out of like reality and not, and what is reality, right? So that's something that the film does really well, I think, and the choices you made to get there, all of you, would be something I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, I mean, this is where collaboration becomes foundational, because I think people are obsessed with, is it verbatim? Is it every word? And my challenge back is always, well, is it verbatim when it's interpreted through the body and mouth and experiences and affects of a performer, of someone who is walking alongside a history with their own understanding of why they're there and what they're doing? And I think that, I always return to this amazing moment in prep with Angelica where went over to her house and was talking about Georgia and talking about the research, and she stopped and was just like, I don't need this. Like, I know who she is because I can feel her, on my skin, and I can feel her in my body. And I think that that's such a striking intervention into our obsession with this kind of archival recovery, as if we're going to find something. What do we imagine we're going to find when we get there? And so what happens if we shift the terms a little bit and think about this not as a kind of casting process or an experiment in performance, but something else, right? Like a really trans investment in finding a third thing that is beyond a kind of truth versus false or performance versus reality binary.
It's also, I think, an incredible locating of oneself in a history that is just like slipping through your fingers and barely reaching the screen. This project in and of itself was such an incredible labor of love with obstacles and the pandemic. There was hellfire. It was hell and high water. And I think that it is an incredible discovery to think about the stories that are ahead of us, the stories that we've yet to find. So much of our history has been an oral history. It's been told to us. It's very undocumented. There is an entire generation of people. I think of Amanda Lear. I was thinking of Amanda Lear watching this, who has, continued to tell a different story about her life, despite the fact this is a French pop star, muse, icon who has, for 60 years denied her trans history, despite it being very readily documented and available. These folks are still out there.
Yeah, and I think that, I like that quote that you read from Jules, because we focus on Garfinkel because of the archive, but we mentioned Robert Stoller a lot, who was a psychiatrist. And, at the turn, in the mid-century, that was what psychiatry was trying to do. It was trying to tell the world something about people they were interviewing that those people didn't know about themselves, right? So, and it produced a certain kind of fact sheet almost with no names and just these details of like, what kind of mother did they have? Did they share a bed after the age of 5? Like, that's probably what led to all these things, right? And I think what we wanted to do was something that wasn't that, right? I mean, to recognize that, like, all the facts in the world aren't going to kind of bring this to life. Like, it's much more about the embodiment and bringing people in to be a part of this history that we found in this, like, cabinet drawer.
Thank you. I mean, I think that calls into some of the questions around, like, the absence of presence, the presence of absence, something that I think, Zackary, you've talked a little bit about, in your practice. And I'm curious if you can speak to kind of how, and maybe this goes too deep into, like, how did you, materialize this character and the subject in a way that, felt authentic to you, and, as an artist already who yourself is performing in different ways, can you speak about, this particular role and how you created that in some way?
The presence of absence. That's such a beautiful thought. And hearing the audio tape from which I was listening back to in that scene was so much like touching this person through time. We are time travelers as humans. That's the incredible thing about being a human, is that you live long enough to move and collapse time over and over again. And I felt very like it was a way of channeling, which I think is what acting is about. The best actors are able to completely lose themselves in a person. Agnes was so compelling to listen to. She was clearly one step ahead of Garfinkel and outwitting him at every beat, in every answer. And despite loving Chase so much, I just shot daggers at him with my eyes. And that was coming not, from an authentic place, but rather from Agnes herself.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that often gets edited out of transcripts in social sciences are these, like, kind of snarky moments from respondents. And I think we put a premium on that those are kind of verbatim. They're like, I can put it in a box and take it home and pet it. I mean, it's, like, hilarious that someone said that in, like, 1959, like, at UCLA. And I always say, like, we don't really, Agnes was, like, 19 years old being interviewed, in 1959 and has, this thing to say. And a lot of the people had this kind of back and forth, and I think that kind of agency and that wit and that humor and that knowledge gets so lost, and you rarely get to see that, I would say, even in social science work today.
I think that's an interesting point, and one that I saw in also, Barbara's and Jimmy's performances, or, their characters were these sort of, like, moments where they're playfully, interacting with Garfinkel in a way, and it made me think a little bit about, the sort of ideas of representation and sort of, like, what are, and this is something from Ryan Wu, the Bruin Film Society, and I were emailing, and he mentioned, what are the benefits and costs of representation, in terms of, like, being on the other side of that. And Jules talks about this a little bit as well. But this film obviously plays with that, and also out of I feel like narratives that we see around what trans representation should be, quote unquote, or whatever that is, right? And so it seems to be, I don't know, playful with that as well in a way. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what that means to you.
Is Ryan here?
Yeah, Ryan, where are you?
Right up there.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for that question. So I'm gonna go.
And did I ask that in a way that was helpful to you, or do you want to? Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan.
So let's go film studies, film club geeky on the answer, which is to say one of the ways in which the film is trying to think about representation is through investing in technology as portals to intimacy and to alienation. So what does it mean that we capture the most intimate touch with our subjects when we're through the lens of a Super 8 camera, something that we know is private and domestic. And when we pop back to that 16, all of a sudden we're in a kind of gauge, in a kind of technology where there's a little bit more access. We see trans people arrive in government and medical films in the 60s and 70s, right? And then we pop to the alienation, the structured black and white shot, reverse shot of the talk show that understands itself to be structured and shot for an audience, neither of whom are on stage, right? And up to the kind of gloss of a 35. And so I'm definitely not trying to lecture in film studies, but rather to say that we're trained how to think about trans people visually through the ways in which they are captured and represented. And so if we can think about how technology teaches us and how technology is always instructing the gaze, the ways in which we're viewing, and therefore how people are presenting themselves back to us, we can sort of slip that question about representation into a different place, where it's less about casting, it's less about who gets to do what when, and instead, how are we setting the frame through which we come to understand people and history.
It's like you have a PhD in film.
So I'm sure the audience has some questions, so please prime them while I ask my sort of last question, although I'll have follow-up if needed, is Chase and Kristen, and obviously there's like just a strong UCLA presence, of course, in the film, but also in your histories. And the film is, of course, as it should be, critical, of what took place here on campus many years ago, and there's still action and work that needs to be done. What's it feel like to be back on campus here with this particular film? I won't bring up the permits, I promise.
You mean the parking permits?
Yeah, absolutely. No one's here who's going to care. Yeah, but anyways, I'd love to. No, you're fine. But
You're going to get a ticket on the way out.
Yeah, we'll work that out. But yeah, no, if you could talk about, what that means for you, especially this film. I mean, Jules, of course, speaks to this as well, having, been inside and outside of the institution and what that's felt like for you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens in the context of the film is we watch Jules reckon with her proximity to the institution, her proximity to the kind of consumptive force of archival work and history making. But arriving here, I feel like we're with a bunch of buddies, and I'm reminded of the vibrant sparks of our power together. I mean, I'm not joking when I say I feel like I've learned how to be a queer person here, for better and for worse. And that's a hugely significant part of my self-understanding as an artist. And the ways in which UCLA was set up at the time that we were here afforded us the opportunity to make a now 20-plus year long friendship, and to listen to the way in which, Zackary literally moved into the space and was like, I could tell a whole story of my life through what's happened in this theater. And those are also very significant forms of kind of concurrent inhabitation that unsettle the easy ways to say UCLA, terrible, violent history, bad place. Nothing is that simple. And I hope that our film is trying to traffic around that question in a different way.
Yeah, I agree. I feel so excited that we got invited. I was mentioning to you in our pre-call that not every university would be excited to think about its own history, and I think just from the actions that are still happening on campus, I was saying that Robert Stoller went on to run a gender clinic for children that, caused, I think, a lot of damage to a whole generation of people who were put in it. And it was activism from students that led to shutting it down, right? It was like articles in the Bruin comparing it to Clockwork Orange and saying that it was basically torture by gay and feminist groups that were part of the steps towards that, right? And so I think that something I've always admired about an institution like UCLA is having the ability to kind of reckon with the history and to really move forward. The gender recognition initiative that you mentioned, it's a really exciting moment. I feel very proud of my alma mater. My other alma mater is the University of Texas, and when I go back there, I'm like, oh my God, it's getting worse every second. It's like a bizarre experience to have gone there and feel that I was ever there on the campus. And it's just coming back here, it's such an opposite kind of feeling. It's exciting to see all that movement and to think about what we didn't have when we were here and what we couldn't even imagine when we were here, and what's going to come in the future.
Talk about time travel.
Exactly, time travel.
And while it's critical of academia, I also feel like it's very generous. It's a very generous gesture because culture exists and academia, frames culture. And, it's not a symbiotic relationship necessarily. And so to bring an academic frame into a cultural space is keeping, I think, the institution itself vibrant. And you're both such wonderful examples of, radical ways of reinventing pedagogy.
I feel like I've heard Chase say the word interlocutor so many times in our conversations, and it really feels like the two of you have, all the three of you, the entire team has that kind of energy that you bring to the project.
And I think, even, down to everybody who was involved, right? Everyone who worked on sound, who worked on cinematography. It really was this very collaborative team project that we're so proud of, kind of creating this community.
So anyone in the team who wants to ask them questions, raise your hand. Or, of course, any students, anyone in the audience, there's students here, theater staff who are here to take questions. So just raise your hand and they'll choose somebody, and I'll call out somebody in the middle and somebody here in the front.
Hi, so I just wanted to say, first of all, I am so immensely thrilled to see trans men in this film. I noticed that a lot of trans men and transmasculine people are very underrepresented, both within and without the trans community. And I guess my question is, how do we take steps to remedy that? And what do you make of that?
Love the trans men in this film, in large part because they are kind of, in my opinion, like really formative early transcultural producers who were attending to your very question of what do we do about the perceived lack of transmasculine representation. So we can look to Max's writing, his very significant autobiography, The Testosterone Files, or Silas's work, films like By Hook or by Crook. And I think their early interventions into transmasculine cultural production has led to a number of very, I would argue, significant cohort docs. Maybe you know them all, but I'm going to name them right now. Films like Southern Comfort and The Aggressives, which are films about transmasculine history that are always positioning trans men alongside their peers and community. It's a real, strategic middle finger to the isolationism that we so often come to know about trans history. And I think there are tons of transmasculine people who are making work, and I think that work is emerging, and happy to get geeky with you at a later time. But I think that it is changing, and it's through a kind of willingness to connect historical work to contemporary questions that some of that is being done.
I see a question in the middle.
You can also scream it out.
I like that people in the middle are unafraid to go for the mic. It's excellent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So I have this experience of being an alum who was also super involved on campus, and now I work with trans teens, and I just all the time come across the feeling that they're all everyone feels like they're reinventing the wheel. They're doing everything for the first time in the world, and I see so many current students here, and I wanted all of your thoughts on that. I also hear about new university committees on trans, students. And I think about okay, well, almost 10 years ago we had that too, and they're probably doing some of the same things over again. And I'm sure before me they had another one, and they were doing, some of the same things. There's kind of this cyclical, having to re-up things over time. I was wondering if you could talk on how you see that kind of almost slightly cyclical, but engaging with that feeling that comes up so much of oh, I'm the first one to do this, I must redo this. And I think that giving this kind of testament from the past kind of helps break that a bit. But I wanted to know your perspectives on that.
Not to get geeky as a gender studies professor, but Audre Lorde would say that one of the mechanisms of the reproduction of oppression is the lack, or the actually siloing off of generations, right? And not having connections between different generations, and that's how you kind of keep things like this always having to be in progress and never having actually made a change. Universities are the worst for this because people leave typically in a 4-year cycle, right? And so, you have to try to put in this scaffolding that's going to create new generations, but there's a lot of things that work against you in that way. I think one of my formative experiences at UCLA was TAing for the Introduction to LGBTQ Studies with Jim Schultz, and I feel like that class changed my life, again, as a person who showed up here from Texas. But most universities don't have that. My own university doesn't have that. We don't have anybody who would teach it. I have students who come to my, gender classes who don't know, about the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, who are queer students. And so a lot of it is if you don't teach a history, right? If you teach a really truncated history, and if you cut off this kind of intergenerational support. I mean, this is something I love about Zackary, that you have this connection to the fabulous Sabrina and all these people, and that history of Hollywood lawn is so important. But it's really it's, I think, gotten even more bifurcated, right? And I think it's losing that kind of knowledge, and I think that is something that institutions kind of do, because it does throw a wrench into social change. So document everything and put it in special collections and be like, here's the work that we did at this time for the next person who tries to find it.
I see a question there.
Yeah, so picking up on some of the themes that people are already asking about, I'm also thinking about how the context for trans lives has changed since, very, so it's in part cyclical, it's in part kind of new in this particular iteration. How has that shaped, or how has that been maybe part of your thinking about the film, about where people might take this film, take what they will from it, and move forward? How has that maybe changed over the course from the beginning of conceiving of the project till now?
Yeah, one of the ways to answer that is to think about how our use of the archival material changed over time. So when we shot the short film, which lands at 19 minutes long, if you were to watch it, you would be, I think, surprised by the amount of personal narrative work that we do as a way to stitch the historical to the contemporary. Zackary does a lot more I grew up in this place, I had these feelings, and we sort of rely on that narrative framing device in order to build trust, to build empathy, to do certain kinds of narrative work. And when we arrived to shoot the feature, many of our incredible collaborators, participants, interlocutors, whether explicit or not, were like, no way. I'm not gonna tell that story anymore. Angelica, we used the moment of conversation with Angelica in the film, but that was definitely had in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different circumstances where people are tired of telling certain kinds of stories and tired on relying upon a kind of I grew up in this place narration of self in order to gain access and advocate for their dignity and right to self-determination. And so one of the things we try to do in the feature is actually do that same kind of work through different pathways. And so if we avoid the kind of trap of the personal, how do we think about the structural? How do we think about the institutional? How do we literally set our sights on the frame and actually depressurize the ways in which we've come to expect trans people to show up to those questions?
Hi, I just wanted to ask, there's something that Jules mentioned about how, and particularly with George's case, there's this sort of need to not make it about what she wants Georgia to be or what she wants these sort of cases and stories to be. And I'm wondering how you balance the need to be aware of your own biases and your own looking at these stories and what you wanted them to be, while also making sure that you humanized them and brought them to life.
It's a great question.
I've been doing a lot of talking. I can keep talking. Great. Thank you for that question. There's a couple different ways that I think would be fun to answer it. One of which is to talk about the collaboration with Brooke Siebold, our editor, who continually returns the frame to story and to feeling, and really is constantly asking, well, who is your audience? Who are we trying to make this film for? Who do we want to invite into the kind of conversation? And a kind of rigorous return to that over time really transformed the story that arrives on screen. And a secondary sort of layer of that rigorous accountability happened the night before we went to camera with Jules, where we all sat in an LA Airbnb and screened the film in process in small string outs to Jules and engaged in her real-time reactions to some of the choices we were already making. And so what you're feeling and seeing on screen, especially as it relates to the moment with Georgia, is an internal critique of the project. Jules is speaking back to some of the choices we were already making, and we're changing the film in real time. We're changing the film as we're making it in service of those kinds of reflections. And I think that those reflections are about consequences. So all of our team is differently saying, well, if you do that, it produces that consequence. Is that where you want to go? Well, if you put that there, then that's the direction we're going to go. What path are we going to take? And so in some ways, it's through that kind of ongoing writing of the project, which happened until we locked, constantly throwing cuts back to our team to say, like, how are we feeling? Where are we going? And it's from that place that we were able to sort of stage and ride that line as best as we could between feeling, but also not getting lost in feeling, to return to my mini lecture on form and the ways in which, right, feeling can sometimes allow us to sidestep other forms of accountability and complicity.
I think we have
I see
time
you,
for two
and I
more
also see you.
questions. So yeah, let's.
Oh shoot, that was really loud. So I had to like write this down because I could not remember it for the life of me. But I said the film mentioned this idea of art making as a queer person is empowering, but also makes you feel somehow like you should shut yourself out of creating and experience life as a queer person. And like that idea of just like shutting yourself out and not wanting to understand yourself as a queer person. My question is, what issues did you face as a queer person creating this film and coming to UCLA, or coming from UCLA? How did you think learning to be a queer person here has affected this work? Sorry, that's a really big question.
You know, I mean, one of the easy ways to walk toward that question is to say that I came to UCLA to go to theater school, and in a first go-round, I hope no one who was in that room is in this room, in the first go-round of introductions, there was a lot of people saying, like, I'm here and I want to be a star. You know, I'm here and I want to move toward the industry in a very strategic way. And I got to tell you, they were very good at it. It was awesome. And some people have extraordinary careers, and I have incredible respect for that work. And I remember it being in that room being like, oh, is that what I want? Is that why I'm here? And I kind of stepped away from theater, film, and television as a momentum toward activist cultures, and started working with, you know, social justice orgs, and started making work in a much more DIY, much more gritty space that was organized around a different set of aesthetics and organized around a different set of questions. And it's through those kinds of choices that I think I understood queerness differently, and then walked back toward the industrial mainstream kind of with those tools. I also want to flag that I see you humans over here as well.
Gosh, okay, hi. This is like such an honor to just be like sitting in front of such brilliant queer professionals. First of all, it's amazing. Second of all, not to out myself here, but I am a theater major as well. And part of the reason that I want to like pursue theater is to be that representation that I lacked when I was growing up. And I'm like, this quarter I get to do that. I'm going to be in a show where I get to portray a transmasculine character, and I'm very excited about that. But this show, this film also like reminded me of, there was this thing that Jules said about like those people that weren't shown, those people that got to live their lives without having to be put in these situations. And my kind of question to you guys is, how do you in your like personal lives balance being that representation and also living for yourself?
It's threading a needle. I mean, sometimes you fail, and sometimes I think it's you're more gracefully able to navigate it. But with great privilege comes great responsibility, and I think that for those of us who are able and comfortable existing in public spheres, we really have a moral obligation to do our part, to push this forward, and for us to do this work for the rest of our lives simultaneously. And the future is better and worse simultaneously. In this film, you're witnessing the origins of the trans medical industrial complex, which is at the center of the culture wars today with pediatric treatment of gender dysphoria. So it's an interesting line, and I think that your question was also extrapolating on, attacks on trans life today. They're not going away. I mean, this is not something that we're going to witness the end of in our lifetimes. It will just continue to transform. And stories from the past are impermeable. They're undeniable. You cannot dismiss them as like the imagination of Hollywood. Like, these people existed. We have existed forever. And by occupying, public space, putting ourselves out there, it's a sacrifice, but I think it's worth it. And then, balancing it, being private, not feeling like you have to.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that I learned through being friends with Zackary is an investment in privacy, right? As like a strategic investment in knowing when you're on and knowing when you're off, and actually trying to invest in that boundary, and to recognize the power of opacity and the power of unknowability is one of the reasons why you can turn out in different ways. And I think that theater, just to keep talking about the discipline, is such a hyper-controlled environment, right, where you get to make really strategic choices. And I think that theater is really interesting training for kind of publicness, because you're always, I'm going to use the word dissociated, but I'm going to use it strategically to say you're doing one thing and you're doing 10 things back here, right, at the same time. And that's like very similar to any kind of public performance. And it's actually a throw to our friend Lauren Berlant, who summarizes teaching in a very similar way. You're teaching and you're also trying to process all of the affects and emotions and feelings and strategies at the same time. I think there's a lot to be shared by sort of de-exceptionalizing performance or the public presentation of self, and thinking about how we're all doing it all the time in different ways.
And I think also, thinking about ways in which like academia or, theater or cultural production really puts a focus on the solo author, right? And I think that is something that is really difficult, because when you're that visible, this is the like burning up under the microscope that, or magnifying glass that Angelica says. And I think, figuring out how to make a world, right, with people who are going to help when, you can't be as visible, or when you can't, that they're going to help support you, and you're going to help them, and trying to build a world together where everybody is doing well, right? Where like everybody is like doing the work that they want to do, and like sometimes it's collaborative and sometimes it isn't. But I think building that kind of world and connection is so important. And again, just plug for intergenerational too. Just go back to that. But
And I feel like we could talk about this for a very long time. Some of these topics are so fascinating, and tomorrow we'll delve a little bit deeper too into these conversations. If you have more burning questions, you should join us tomorrow at 7. Refreshments will be served at 6 at the Charles Young Library on campus. In the conference room, there'll be signs when you get there. That's also free. We really hope that you can join and have some conversations with Kristen, Chase, and also Vanessa Wari, who's a PhD student at UCLA as well. So you said, the future is both scary. A version of the future is both scary and also promising. And I think that what you've brought tonight is part of the promising part. And we really just appreciate you coming to the archive. So thank you. Please join me in thanking
Thank you.
our colleagues.